Hello and welcome back to the channel, everybody. I am your host, Vortex, from MobileMusicPro.com, your home for mobile music production. And if you're new to the channel, what we do here is create weekly videos teaching people how to produce music. Our goal here is to get as many people producing music as possible, and the best way to start making new music is on an iOS device. So if you do want to help us out with that mission, make sure to smash those likes, subscribe, and share out the show. Now today's video is yet another entry in our new ongoing series where we're teaching you the fundamentals of music production by showing you how to use the plugins inside Cubasis 3. And the fifth video in that series will be today's video covering the limiter plugin. Now in basic terms, a limiter is basically just a very extreme compressor. Now of course we already spoke about the compressor in a previous video in this series, so make sure you check that out in the links below. But just to quickly recap, what a compressor actually does is control the dynamic range of a track, gradually reducing the signal above a desired threshold, bringing the louder bits down to the more quieter bits, giving you an overall more even signal. Now, a limiter works in a very similar way, except it completely prevents the signal from going above a desired threshold. Limiters are often used to drive sounds louder without clipping and are often added on drum tracks and on the master track during the mastering process. This is done to ensure that all of the sounds and the track overall is safely playable across a variety of different systems. And these systems include things like concert halls or speakers at your local grocery store or even car speakers and a variety of other different types of speakers as well. Alright, now with that intro aside, let's get right into showing you how to use the limiter plugin inside Cubasis 3. Hello and welcome everybody. We are wishing you the happiest of the happiest from Mobile Music Pro to wherever you are in the world. And we just wanted to remind you guys again that most, if not all, of the knowledge in today's video can be applied to virtually any limiter inside any DAW. As we mentioned, the overall goal of a limiter is to drive sounds louder without having them clip. Now, for those that are unaware, digital clipping happens when the signal tries to go above 0 dB, but in fact the system cuts it off right there at the very top at 0 dB. And what this actually results in is some very nasty sounds. You'll be hearing a bunch of extra artifacts, a bunch of extra distortion, and a bunch of extra clipping noises. It's just really not good, and we'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. Now, we just thought it was important to mention that you can get away with some clipping and some distortion inside of analog gear, where that can actually sometimes sound pleasant, like some extra saturation. But of course, this channel focuses on software and digital plugins inside the iPad. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started and show you where the limiter actually is. Now, Cubasis actually comes with two different kinds of limiters. The first is a standard limiter, and the second is a brick wall limiter. And we'll get into the differences of both of those in just a minute. What we have here is an exported WAV file from a project that we created for a previous video. And that's what we're going to be using as an example of a song today that we're going to use the limiter on. As we said, the main reason to use a limiter is to drive sounds louder without having them clip. And the main tracks that you add a limiter on is to drum tracks or to the master track during the mastering process. And the latter is what we're going to be focusing on today. So let's go ahead and show you now how to add a brand new limiter. So let's go ahead and hit Mixer to expose our master track here all the way on the right hand side. And what we're going to do is tap on the E button here to begin adding effects. And then we're going to tap to add effect and tap on internal effects and choose our limiter. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger there. There we go. And make sure we are on our default preset, so we'll tap on Factory Presets, and here we go. So what we're going to do now is explain the limiter plugin. We'll explain all of the controls and the labels, and we'll start from left to right. And the first control that we have here on the far left-hand side is the drive slider. Now what the drive actually does is multiply your audio signal before it hits the limiter. And again, this can be very useful for driving your sounds louder. Now for some reason the default is set to 15 dB, which is pretty high. Personally, when I'm using this plugin, I really don't ever add too much more than 3 or 4 or 5 dB of drive. But again, it's all up to your personal preference. Now moving on to the center of the plugin here, at the very top we have the in level and reduction. And this is very much like a compressor because like we said, a limiter is pretty much like a compressor, only an extreme version of one. So what we have here is the in level first. That will show you how much signal is actually coming into the limiter. And below that we have our reduction meter, which will show you how much dB of the signal you're actually reducing. Now below that we have our standard attack and release sliders. The attack is going to determine how long it takes for that limiter to kick in, and then subsequently the release will tell you how long it will take for the limiter to back off. And then finally on the far right hand side here we have the output slider, which determines the level of your overall signal, and essentially acts like a makeup gain on a compressor. And that's pretty much all there is to it for the limiter plugin. Now, before we actually show you this in action, we're going to bring up the brick limiter and explain that as well. So let's go ahead and close this out, go to our mixer, and go to our master track on the far right hand side and tap on the effects button. And what you'll notice is by default there will be a brick limiter plugin here already added. And much like all the other plugins that Cubasis adds by default, it will be disabled by default. So let's go ahead and tap on the E to bring up our brick wall limiter and drag this up to be a little bit bigger. And once again, make sure we are on our default preset. There we go. Now, really the only difference between a regular limiter and a brick wall limiter is that a brick wall limiter will absolutely let no sound above a certain threshold, where a standard limiter will be a little bit more forgiving and actually allow some of the transients to pass through the threshold. An also important thing to note is that the brick wall limiter is generally the very last plugin on your effect chain. So let's go ahead and explain some of these controls here. So as you can see, it is a little bit slightly different than the regular limiter in that we only have a threshold and release control. Now above those two sliders, we have our standard in level and reduction and out level meters. The in level showing us how much signal is actually coming into the limiter, the reduction meter showing us how much of the signal we're actually reducing, and then below that we have our final output level, which of course tells us how loud the overall signal is. Now what this threshold slider actually does is determine the amount of dB where the brick limiter kicks in, so that any amount of signal that exceeds this threshold level of dB will actually get completely cut off. As we said, the brick wall limiter will completely cut off the signal, and the standard limiter will still allow a little bit of transients through, which is generally why the brick limiter is all the way at the very end. And then below that we have our release slider, which specifies how long the reduction will last after the signal falls below a certain desired threshold. Okay, so that is the limiter and brick limiter. Now let's go ahead and see these in action. So what we'll do is close this out, go to our mixer, tap on our effects, and go back to our regular limiter. And we'll pull that up by tapping on the E. Now let's just drag this up a little bit bigger so we can see, and go to the default preset by tapping on factory presets and tapping on default. And before we start using the limiter, what I want to show you now is how loud this track actually is at the moment. So what we're going to do is play the track and show you how loud it gets on our master meter. So let's close out of this real quick and go back to our mixer and drag that up a little bit more. And let's first put on the headphones. So let's quickly make sure that our limiter is disabled. Alright, that is disabled. And now let's go ahead and play this and see how loud this track actually gets. Alright, perfect. As you can see there, we actually aren't clipping just yet. So we never actually saw any red lines there on the left or right channels. But the track itself is still very quiet as it hasn't been mastered yet. So what we want to do is use our limiter to drive this track louder. And also really quickly we wanted to point out how there's no clipping in the audio wave file as well. So we can zoom into this here and see that there is actually no clipping. So you'll see that the lines, the actual transients, the peaks and the valleys never go above 0 dB. If they had gone above 0 dB, you would see the transients extend all the way to the very top and get cut off like a square. And we'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. But before we do that, let's go ahead and start applying our limiter. So we'll go back to our mixer, and then tap on the effects for our master track, and let's go ahead and tap on limiter. And we'll drag this back up again. Make sure we're on our default preset. There we go. Okay, now let's go ahead and start driving the volume up on this track. Usually I like to start with the subtle limitations preset here on the far left hand side, and then make a few adjustments right away. Like I said, I usually don't like to drive up very loud, maybe a couple dB. We'll just start out with like 4 dB, maybe even 3 dB actually. In fact, I'm going to start out with like 2.5 dB. I like to keep the drive pretty low, because if you do drive this too much, you're going to get a whole lot of distortion that you don't want. So let's up our output a little bit, maybe by about 5 dB here, to make sure that we get this a little bit louder. And we'll go over loudness in just a second and go over some of those volumes that services like Spotify and iTunes expect. But before we do that, let's go ahead and try out this limiter. So we have the settings that we want now, and we'll go ahead and hit back. And what we're going to do is we're going to enable and disable this plugin while the track plays. And what you should be able to notice is a significant increase in volume. So let's hit play. Alright, perfect. As you heard there was a pretty big increase in volume. Now let's go ahead and take a look what our meter looks like on our master track. So we'll hit the mixer, and let's just see how much this volume has increased. We'll go to the loudest part of the track, right around here, and hit play. Now, as you can see here, we did increase the volume, but now we are clipping, so we're actually going above 0 dB. And we can actually show you what that looks like. So what I want to do real quick now is show you guys what a track looks like when it's clipping excessively. So to simulate that, let's go ahead and go to our track. We'll tap on Insert Effects. Let's enable our channel strip and just crank our drive way up there. Let's just crank it all the way to the top. We'll go to 10 dB here. We'll add 10 dB in our drive. And now what we're going to do is hit the freeze button. That'll just take a second. And now what we can do is zoom in here and take a look. Now, what we can see here, if you look real closely, in fact, there we go, let's zoom in a little bit more. Now, what we can see here, if you look closely, is you see how this wave goes up right here, but doesn't actually go all the way to the top. And we can even zoom in just a little bit more so you guys can see. You see how this peak goes up and then down, not fully reaching the top at 0 dB, but this particular peak not only reached 0 dB at the very top, but then got completely cut off by the limiter, until the sound was quiet enough again to come back down. Now, digital clipping is something that we definitely don't want to happen. Again, it can sound very gross, very distorted, having a bunch of clipping noises and so on. We don't want that. So let's go ahead and play for you what that sounds like now. What we're going to do is actually turn down the mixer volume very low, because this particular track has been turned up very loud. And in fact, we might have to still fix it in post. But let's go ahead and turn this whole project down more, maybe by a little bit, by about 10 dB. Basically the same that we upped the previous track volume. And let's hear what this sounds like. We'll go ahead and zoom out real quick. There we go. Now let's hear what this sounds like. You should hear a bunch of different distortion and clipping. Do you guys hear that ugly distortion in there that goes through the entire track? That is called digital clipping. And again, that is something that we do not want. So let's go ahead and delete this track for now. And let's go ahead and remove the channel strip plugin there and make sure that we are back at 0 dB in our master track. And we'll just bring up the limiter so you guys can see what we did one more time. There we go. Now again, we do have this limiter going and giving us some more gain. It is making the track louder, but it is giving us some clipping. Not too crazy clipping, in fact, just barely clipping. And in fact, we can even add 1 more dB of output if we really like to. But that will increase the clipping. So what we have to do now is fix this clipping. We've used the standard limiter to increase the volume of our overall track. Now let's use a brick limiter to make sure that our track never ever ever goes over 0 dB. So let's remove this here. Go back to our mixer screen and tap on our E on our master track, and this time we're going to enable the brick wall limiter. So let's tap on the E to bring up our brick wall limiter and make this a little bit bigger again. And let's go start out with our default preset here. Now, as usual, Steinberg comes with a bunch of great presets for pretty much every plugin. These offer great starting points for both novices and experts alike, and you'll find a few over here, such as Podcaster and Mixtamer. Now, generally, what I like to start out with is the Podcaster preset. As you can see, it is a very fast release and a pretty small threshold, mostly designed for vocals, as the name of the preset indicates. So what I'm going to do is increase the threshold just a little bit here to around 3 dB, and increase the release a little bit as well to around 100 ms. Now this should ensure that our signal never ever again goes above 0 dB. So let's go ahead now and bring up our master track. So once again, just to recap here real quick, we have our limiter and our brick wall limiter. We have our limiter, which is increasing the overall volume of our track, and then we have our brick limiter cutting off the signal at 0 dB. So let's see what this sounds like now. We'll go to the loudest part of the track and hit play. Alright, perfect. So as you can see from the far right hand side, not only did we increase the overall volume of the track, but we prevented the overall project from clipping. And now really quickly, we wanted to go over a couple of different terms relating to loudness. Now unfortunately, the default limiter inside of Cubase's 3 here doesn't really give us a couple of additional details like RMS or LUFS. So let's go ahead and grab a third-party tool that will give us a bit more information. So let's close this out, go to our mixer, we're going to go to our E, I'm going to tap to add effect. And we're going to go to our audio units and tap on the Analyzer FX app by 4Pockets. And then we're going to go under our presets drop down, and we're going to go scroll down a little bit here and find the peak, RMS, and LUFS option. We'll tap on that. Let's make sure that this is the very last app in the chain because we do want this to measure all of the signal. So let's drag this down here to the bottom, and we're going to disable our other limiter plugins for now. Now let's open up our analyzer. Let's make this a little bit bigger here. There we go. Now let's explain a couple of these terms here. On the left-hand side, we have the peak. The peak is the highest volume that the track has reached. To the right of that, we have the RMS. RMS standing for root mean square. And the RMS is the average volume that the track reached. So the peak is the highest volume and the RMS is the average volume. And then finally, to the right of the RMS, we have our LUFS setting. LUFS stands for Loud Units Full Scale. Now for the longest time we generally used RMS, but more recently people have begun using the new LUFS standard. And the main reason that we did that is because the RMS takes into account all the frequencies that we can't hear. So in general, the LUFS setting will give you much more accurate data in relation to the loudness of your track. Now, generally speaking, when you're mastering your track, what you want to shoot for is around -10 RMS, or between -11 and -16 LUFS. Now, different services such as Spotify or iTunes have slightly different LUFS requirements, and you can always, of course, Google what those exact ones are. But you don't have to worry too much because if your track is a little bit too loud, it will bring it down to the required level. But that, of course, may end up reducing the quality or dynamic range of your track, so it's best to get it right before. So let's go ahead and take a reading here. We're going to go to the loudest part of our track, right around the 12th bar here. So what we're going to do now is take a measurement and try to find the average loudness of this track. So we'll go down to the plugin and tap the reset button, and then we'll tap the start button. And now let's hit play. So we've hit the stop button there, and as you can see on our LUFS, it's around -16 or -17 dB so far. So still quite a bit of headroom left to increase the volume. So now let's go ahead and enable our limiter plugins and see how much louder we can get. So we'll go back to the mixer, tap on our E, and enable our limiter plugins. And we'll drag our analyzer below our brick wall again so that we can get the most accurate setting. And now let's bring up our analyzer plugin, make this a little bit bigger again. Let's go to the loudest part of the track, hit the reset button, hit the start button, and now let's hit play. Alright, perfect. Now as you can see on the LUFS setting, we hit around -9 dB, which is a little bit too loud for our preference as we're trying to hit around -11 dB. So what we'll do is go back to our limiter and decrease our output a little bit. So we'll go to our limiter, and let's go ahead and make this 4 dB instead of 6 dB. And maybe set our drive to around 3 dB instead of 2. Now let's go back to our mixer, go back to our plugins, and back to our analyzer. And let's go ahead and hit play once more. We'll go to our loudest part of the track, and we'll hit reset, hit start, and let's hit play. All right, there we go. As you can see, we got a little bit closer there, around negative 10.64 dB. So a little bit closer to our desired negative 11 dB range. Now, of course, this really isn't all that there is to mastering, folks. Mastering is an entire discipline by itself. Some of the usual roles that we divide music creation up into is something like producers, mixing engineers, and mastering engineers, each with their own unique skill set. Now, can you do all of this yourself? Well, of course you can. And modern plugins do make it easier and easier to do this every year. But of course, there's no replacement for Grammy award-winning mixing and mastering engineers. But nevertheless, we can use some of these plugins here to get some pretty great results for our home studio. Alright, if you guys are still rocking with us, then we just can't thank you enough for being here. And we especially can't thank all the people that are watching our videos live to help us build out our community. Now, we hope that this video did clear up all the confusion that you had around what a limiter actually is, or what a limiter is versus a brick limiter, and so forth. Because the limiter plugin really is one of the most misunderstood plugins by new producers. So we thought we'd make a quick video to help explain it all to you. As usual, it really is all about learning how to use your own ears instead of just relying on meters telling you if the sound is good or if it's loud enough. And just a quick reminder that our recent contest has ended on November 25th, and you can find all the winners that have been revealed on our website at mobilemusicpro.com/contest. And we just wanted to quickly thank everybody again for all the hard work and passion that they put into their tracks. And if you didn't win this time, don't worry, make sure you stick around because we will be having more giveaways and contests in the future. And hey guys, don't forget about our recently launched Discord chat where the conversation can continue long after our live premieres and live streams have ended. And you'll always be able to find a link to join that chat in the description below. And finally, we did just wanted to remind you that we just recently announced our brand new sample pack, and that's going to be released on January 6th. So if you want to find out more information about that and all the other stuff that we're doing over here at Mobile Music Pro, make sure to sign up for our free mailing list at mobilemusicpro.com. And so, until next time everybody, keep talking music and we'll see you later. But just to quickly recap, what a compressor is actually used for is to control the dynamic range. But really quickly, just to recap, God damn it. Now today's video is yet another entry in our new ongoing series where we're teaching you the fundamentals.